This move immediately claims central space and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, preparing for rapid development and controlling key squares. This move initiates the Caro-Kann defense, a solid and reliable choice that aims to create a robust pawn structure and control key central squares without immediately committing its queen's pawn. This move establishes a strong central pawn presence, immediately challenging black's setup and opening lines for white's pieces, preparing to control key squares and develop actively. This move immediately challenges white's central pawn and initiates the well-known Caro-Kann defense, aiming for solid pawn structure and active piece play. This move prepares to support the d4 pawn and potentially develop the bishop to f4 or g5, aiming for a solid Caro-Kann classical setup. This move transitions into the modern variation of the Caro-Kann defense, aiming to open lines for piece activity and challenge white's central pawn structure. This recaptures the pawn with a central knight, developing a piece and maintaining control of important central squares while keeping the pawn structure intact. This move, developing the knight to d7, aims to support the central pawn structure and prepare for further development, potentially challenging white's central control. This aggressive move immediately targets black's f7 pawn, a common tactical motif that often leads to a quick attack or material gain if black is not careful. This move develops the knight to a central square, reinforcing the e5 pawn and preparing for further development, while avoiding the immediate threat posed by white's knight on g5. This move develops a piece to an active square and prepares to castle kingside, putting immediate pressure on black's central pawn structure. This move prepares to develop the kingside bishop and contest the d5 square, aiming to challenge white's central control and potentially create a pawn break. This move develops the knight to a more flexible square, allowing for potential central control and support for kingside action while preparing to castle. This move challenges white's central pawn presence and aims to develop a more dynamic pawn structure, opening lines for black's pieces. Castling kingside solidifies the king's safety, preparing to connect the rooks and bring them into the game. This move prepares to dislodge white's aggressive knight, which is currently well placed on g5 and cramping black's kingside. This move repositions the knight to f3, a more central square that supports the d4 pawn and prepares for potential kingside castling, while also maintaining flexibility for future pawn pushes. This move prepares to challenge white's central control and potentially create a queenside pawn majority by advancing the queenside pawns. This move aims to prevent black from establishing a strong pawn chain with b5, while also potentially preparing to expand on the queenside or gain space. This pawn capture opens the c-file, potentially creating attacking opportunities for black while challenging white's central pawn presence. The recapture of the pawn on d4 with the knight on e4 strategically centralizes this knight and challenges black's pawn structure, aiming to exploit the open d-file and potentially create attacking chances. Developing the bishop to d6 directly challenges white's knight on g5 and prepares to castle, aiming for active piece play in the center. This move centralizes the queen, aiming to support pawn breaks and potentially create attacking opportunities on the kingside or through the center. This move initiates the development of the knight to a more central square, aiming to support the e-pawn and potentially prepare for kingside castling or a central pawn push. In the future, this move repositions the knight to a more active central square, preparing to support a kingside attack or challenge black's central control. This move develops the queen to a more active square, supporting the pawn on c5 and preparing to potentially challenge white's control of the d-file and the e-file. This retreat of the knight to f3 aims to reinforce the center. Prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside with f4, and offer support to the other knight if it decides to advance. This move brings the king to safety, a common strategic goal in many openings, and prepares to connect the rooks for future central play and potential pawn advances. This move prepares to develop the queenside bishop to b2, reinforcing the central control and potentially opening a long-term diagonal for that piece. This move prepares to develop the queenside bishop to b7, aiming to control the long diagonal and potentially challenge white's central control and piece activity. The move 16, b-flat2 repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, where it influences key central squares and prepares to potentially support pawn advances on the kingside or queenside. This move develops the bishop to a natural square where it supports the central pawns and eyes the kingside. Developing the rook to the d-file directly challenges black's central control and prepares for potential pawn pushes or tactical operations on the open file. This move boldly centralizes the knight and prepares to challenge white's dominant knight on f3, aiming to improve black's piece activity and potentially create imbalances. The rook now occupies the d-file, which is becoming increasingly important as black's central pawn structure is challenged in potentially weakening. This pawn thrust opens lines for black's pieces and challenges white's control of the queenside, aiming to create active counterplay against white's centralized army. This move simplifies the position by exchanging pieces, opening the b-file for white's rook and potentially creating an isolated d-pawn for black if their e-pawn recaptures, which should be carefully considered. Black recaptures the bishop, simplifying the position and maintaining piece activity after white's bishop exchange on the d5 square. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to attack the f7 pawn and potentially create tactical opportunities. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to develop the kingside and potentially challenge white's control of the center. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to support a central pawn advance or to improve coordination with other pieces, potentially preparing for a kingside attack or reinforcing the center. The move qb7 prepares to transfer the queen to the kingside via c7 and h7, aiming to support a pawn break with g5 or to add pressure on the kingside if white's pawns advance. This move simplifies the position, forcing an exchange of knights and eliminating a potentially active piece for black while opening lines for white's rooks. This move recaptures the bishop, reinforcing control of the d5 square and preparing to challenge white's advanced knights. The rook on g4 aims to exploit the weakened dark squares on the kingside, potentially targeting the h6 pawn or creating discovered attacks if black moves their bishop. With white's rook now aggressively placed on g4, the black king wisely retreats to h8 to escape the immediate attacking potential along the g-file. This move directly challenges black's pawn chain and aims to exploit the weakened light squares on the queenside after black's previous pawn advances. This move opens lines for black's pieces and challenges white's pawn structure, preparing to activate the queen and potentially target white's weakened kingside. This move initiates a powerful attack on black's queenside pawn structure, creating threats against the vulnerable c4 pawn and the pinned bishop on f6. The capture on b2 aims to simplify the position and potentially create an open b-file, though it also allows white to recapture with a rook and gain central pawn control. Capturing the bishop on b2 recaptures material and simplifies the position. But it opens the A file for black's rook, creating potential attacking chances. Black's move 26. Rg8 aims to connect the rooks and activate the g8 rook, preparing for potential central pawn breaks or defense of the kingside. This move initiates an aggressive rook lift to the kingside, aiming to exploit white's weakened kingside pawn structure and coordinate with the knight for a direct attack on the black king. The king retreats to the relative safety of h7, clearing the g8 square for potential counterplay and avoiding immediate checks on the h-file. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to control central squares and potentially attack the black king's defenses. This pawn sacrifice is a calculated risk to open the c-file and create immediate threats against white's kingside, aiming to disrupt white's attack before black's king is fully secured. This move correctly centralizes the rook on the e-file, contesting its control and preparing for potential advances or attacks on the kingside. This move connects the rooks and brings them to the open c-file, preparing to challenge white's control of the central files and potentially create counterplay on the queenside. This move aims to consolidate the queen's position, prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside with the queen's support, and potentially defend against black's threats along the c-file. This move initiates a critical pawn break, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces, particularly the queen and rooks, towards the kingside. This move initiates a direct kingside attack, seeking to open lines against black's king by sacrificing a pawn to expose weaknesses. This move desperately tries to block the open g-file and disrupt white's attacking momentum, but it weakens the dark squares around black's king. This rook retreat prepares to contest the h-file, aiming to support the pawn push and potentially create attacking chances against black's weakened kingside. This move seeks to exploit the open c-file by creating an immediate threat against white's queen, forcing it to a less active square and potentially enabling black to gain initiative on the queenside.